So you decided to create your own fantasy atlas. You worked together with your players. You compile the maps and the notes into one enormous document, and the question arises, what do you do next? Hello adventurers, and welcome back to the Red Quills. My name is Ryan, and today I am continuing along the project that got everyone excited earlier this year, the fantasy atlas that I'm making for my own world, the Kingdom of Endon. Today I'm moving away from the individual concepts and the overviews and the historical benefits of looking into creating an atlas, and I'm looking at the actual step-by-step, what steps I'm taking to compile it, how I'm organizing it, how I'm categorizing it, and how I'm describing the individual entries. This episode will continue the Atlas series, diving deeper into the process of compiling a usable, structured fantasy atlas. In my previous video in this series, How I'm Making a Fantasy Atlas, I covered historical atlases, the essential components of an atlas, and how to introduce it both in-world and at the table. Now we're moving beyond the concepts and into the actual process of organizing and compiling an atlas that is both functional and immersive. I'm going to use my own Kingdom of Endon as an example, and I'll walk through how I've divided the kingdom into duchies, sorted its towns and villages, ruins, dungeons and mines, and used symbols and colors for navigation. As I go through, I'll be talking and creating the duchy maps that I'm using as the basis for the division of the kingdom that I'll go into in a few moments. And you can see how I've created this new style of maps using a combination of paint and ink. What I want to do is provide a step-by-step guide for world builders who want to create a more cohesive atlas to ensure that your world's history, your geography, your storytelling potential are all woven together seamlessly in one single document. I'm not here to convince you why you need a fantasy atlas. I'm sure you've already convinced yourself whether or not you want to have one. Over the series of videos that I'm creating, I'm going to go through my journey in creating my own fantasy maps and atlases, compiling them together to be a resource that I can use for world building and dungeon mastering. So I've been making my own fantasy world for quite some time now, and I have any number of maps and charts and diagrams and globes hanging around the place. And I'm sure that you do for your own worlds as well. If you've been compiling your world for any significant amount of time, then it's only natural that you'll want to explore it in a way that a simple role-playing game doesn't allow you to. So, what's going to happen over the course of this series, in which I create a fantasy atlas over the course of several months, is I'm going to take all of the various plans and charts and diagrams from my own world and compile them into a fantasy atlas, showing you how you can do it to your own worlds and telling you what I could have done better, what I'll learn, and some techniques that I picked up along the way. In the last video, we talked about the basics of creating your fantasy atlas, like the history of creating atlases in our own worlds, the fundamentals of having a reference map that you can use and refer back to in order to keep the atlas consistent, and so on. In this video, I'm going to talk about how I'm compiling the atlas, how I'm organizing it, and how I'm creating the descriptions of the various locations to stick in the atlas. Now, as I talked about in the last video, in the historical evidences of atlases that we have, they were generally made to order, at least in the earliest examples that we have of them. They'd be compiled according to some maps made by separate cartographers. And as we've gone on in history, atlases have more and more meant less a collection of maps and more a collection of maps of the world, all of which can reference one another. Whether that's something that you want to do for your own world is entirely up to you. I'm only doing it for one small corner, the Kingdom of Endon, which is about 150 miles across in any direction. It's not big, but it provides me with enough of a challenge that I can create an atlas about it. If you're creating your own atlas, I would recommend starting small first and getting big later on. So because I'm starting with the Kingdom of Endon, the first challenge that came to me was how to categorize and organize the atlas, how to compile it in a way that made sense. And there are several ways to do this. I could just make it alphabetical, I could delineate it by area, or I could delineate it by different kinds of map. In my specific case, I went for the second of the three options. In my original version of the atlas, this one, what I did was I divided it according to various different towns, and then dwarven heims, caves and mines, and then finally the various magical sites around the kingdom. And that worked out all right. But for a much larger atlas, this is only the first draft, I'm going to need to make it easier to find specific locations for someone who's navigating the kingdom. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to divide the kingdom into 7 duchies and the capital. I haven't added the capital to the atlas yet because it's going to be its own subsection. I'll make a whole video about making the capital city in an atlas later on. But in my case, the 7 duchies are the locational divisions that the atlas is based on. Because of the way that I'm designing it, each of the duchies has a roughly equal number of locations already existing in the atlas. And in this second version of the atlas that I'm uploading specifically for this video, you can check it out in the description below. You can download it on my Patreon for free. You'll find that I've added in more points than I had in the original. Extra dungeons, mines, castles, and villages. And what I'm going to do, having divided the atlas into different duchies, is then have it easy to find specific points within those duchies by having a reference map, and then using the reference map to categorize the individual points. So the first step that I'm going to undertake is to divide the atlas into locations, categories of areas that different parts of the atlas can fit into. In my case, it's the duchies. In your case, it can be different kingdoms, it can be different continents. It's entirely up to you. Because the second point is to divide each of the entries into its own category. You can have urban areas. You can start with villages, moving on to towns, and then cities. For uninhabited places, there's differences between dungeons and ruins, places of magic, or even caves and mines. On top of that, you've got political markers as well, like castles, forts, walls, gates, things like that. And then on top of that, you have natural formations. You can have your own entries for forests, for mountains, for rivers, things like that. I'm going to put up a rubric, a suggested list of the categories that you divide the points in your atlas into. If you have other concepts, other categories that you want to add into your atlas, stick it in the comments below. I'd love to hear your thoughts. As I'm expanding my own atlas, I'm going to continue to look into ways that I can make it more and more streamlined, easier and easier for a person to use. Which brings us to the third point that I want to make in this video, how to write the entry for an individual point in the atlas. You can see by looking at the first version of the atlas just how far I've come from my initial drafts to what I've got now, and I'm sure it will continue to evolve as I continue to create the atlas. But this is the entry that I originally had for Glaston. And it works basically. I had an overall description of the city and then 3 sub-points that you could use to flesh out different quests and understand more about the history and society that lives in the town. I also, in many of the entries, had small excerpts written by the author of the atlas, a fictional person named Cornelius de Mar. And it's something that I wanted to take into this current version of the atlas. The new version of the descriptions are much more detailed and much longer than the originals. You can see in the newest version of the atlas, I have several pages devoted to Glaston alone. And the reason that I've done this is because I've not only decided how I'm going to use the atlas, but I also want to be able to expand upon it in future. It's more and more of an understanding of what the kingdom entails and less of an overview of its history and society. The new entries for the atlas are much longer and much more complicated, mainly because I decided why I was creating the atlas and what it was going to be used for. In this particular case, the atlas is a resource for me and me alone. In the first version, I just created it because I wanted it to be a resource for a fictional fantasy cartographer that was creating the world, something that I could use to escape a little bit. But the new version of the atlas that I'm creating is a resource for me, the Dungeon Master. And because I'm doing that, it means that I know that I have to add more details than I normally would. The original version only had an overview of its societies, cultures, histories, and politics. The new version is more in depth. It begins with a 1-paragraph description of the city, something that can be read at a glance and used to understand it. For instance, if one of my players were to ask me about the overview of a city and I can't remember it off the top of my head, I can flick through the atlas and get enough of a picture that I can use that to roleplay. Following that, there's more of an in-depth understanding of the overview of the city. A few more paragraphs to describe its place in the overall kingdom, its history, and its people. And then, specifically for me as the Dungeon Master, I have an excerpt that is an illustrative description of what it is like to enter the city, so that I can use that as a basis for role-playing. When they enter the city, I can use it straight from the atlas and then ad-lib from there. After that, depending on the size of the city, I either divide it into subcategories or I talk about the major landmarks in the city, giving them descriptions, histories, and understandings. Generally, when I create an entry, I ask myself, what places are important for the plot? What places are important for the players? And what places are important for the world? Using those three, it means that I generally have at least 3 or even 6 points for even a small village. And that's the basis for where we go from there. There are all sorts of ways that you can compile and memorize a fantasy world. You can make a stack of exercise books, you can write everything down into a Wikipedia page, but I find creating a fantasy atlas to be the most compelling and imaginative way of doing it. When you use this atlas properly, when you create it into a resource that is for your own use as well as for a fictional cartographer's use, then it's going to be something that you can continue to refer to over and over. You can return back to the same pages, you can read the descriptions, you can feel yourself immersed in the hustle and bustle of a life in another world. So this latest version of the Atlas is more complete than the previous version. It has more entries, more understanding, more in-depth descriptions of what it's like to live there, as well as the new maps, new illustrations, and new locations that I've added to version 2 of the Atlas of Endon. You can, as I mentioned, check it out on the Red Quills Patreon. If you have your own Atlas work that you are undertaking, please share it either in the comments below, or you can join the Red Quills Discord. The link is in the description below. We're creating a community of world builders and map makers there. That's just an absolute joy to be a part of. And if you like this project, if you want to stay on board, if you want to be a part of any upcoming projects that I'm working on, hit that subscribe button. You can even sign up for the mailing list, which comes out once a week, and it includes everything that is involved with what I do. So it has the video, it has the downloadables, it has links to all the Discords and my website and the blog posts, and a weekly mapping challenge or tip. So you can check that out as well. Let me know what you're doing for your own atlases, please. I would love to see them. If you have your own thoughts about what you're doing to compile it, what you think that I should add to my own entries, what you add to yours, stick it in the comments below. But it is much easier to contact me on the Red Quills Discord. Please like and subscribe to help this video find more world builders. Let me know if you have any questions or what you would like me to address in the next Atlas video, which will come out in 8 weeks' time. I'm going to come out with one every 2 months. Thank you for watching, and I will see you next week.